What is going on, Fantasy Fam? Welcome to the Week 5 edition of Plugged In. I am your host, JM Twin from OneWeekSeason.com, here with my guest / owner of Fantasy Points, where you're watching this, Scott Barrett. Scott, my good friend, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I kind of a crazy morning because I had a podcast I usually record, my solo podcast I record on Mondays. I did it on Tuesday morning this week. So I'm kind of boom, hopped in here at the last minute. We didn't get to chat at all before we came on air, but it doesn't mean I don't love you, and excited to do today's show. I'm actually excited because like you said on Saturday, we chatted on the phone and you said, I think that regardless of how results go, Tuesday's show will be great. We have, I think, some good stuff to talk about in terms of this last weekend and how we approached this last weekend and whether or not that was plus EV and so on and so forth. How was your DFS weekend?
Yeah, I got rocked this weekend. Was a no good, horrible, very bad weekend. Just got absolutely wrecked. What about you?
Yeah, same. And it was my first non-profitable weekend since week 1. And that was props. I got some money back, but not enough to call it a profitable weekend. But what's funny is it was, I think, one of the most plus EV rosters I've ever built. And that's just because of the nature of the way that the slate worked out. Like Josh Jacobs was chalk and had a career game. Jamal Williams was chalk and had a career game. And Jamal Williams' career game is something that we talked about as far as like what is his real ceiling, right? Like he doesn't even have a Barry U ceiling. He put up 26 points at $6K in salary, right? This isn't old DraftKings where the backup running back is priced at 4,400 or something. It was like he was still like a yardage and touchdown back that was going to be super popular at 6,100. Got the same number of touches that we said he would probably get, like around 18 to 19 to 20 touches. Ended up popping in 2 touchdowns, had his first, I think it was his first ever carry of 25 plus yards of his career, went for a 51-yard touchdown in that one. So yeah, I mean, a week like that, I'm going to have some chalk, and we'll talk about that too. You and I talked about this on Saturday, but I'm going to have some chalk if I really like it, if I'm convicted on it. I don't mind having chalk, but the chalk that hit was not chalk I was going to have, just because its range of outcomes was way too broad and its chance of having a had-to-have-it game was too low. But yeah, I mean, probably my biggest disappointment was no George Pickens on my main roster. I talked about him in every spot last week and then didn't pull the trigger on him. I put Geno Smith on my roster that I built with Joe Holka last week. He's one of my quarterbacks, but by the time we got to the weekend, I was like, you know what, I'm going Josh Allen or Jalen Hurts, and I don't regret that. So yeah, it's just one of those weekends is kind of how I see it. What about you? What was kind of your takeaway, and what was do you think any like errors, or do you think it was just kind of the way things worked out?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's sort of tough to tell, and we constantly preach on this show that it's impossible to finish in the green every single week. And I've been right there every single week thus far. And this week I was, not even close. And that stings a little bit, but it's like, hey, you want to finish either first or last place. And it's like, what was this, good process? Was this right? Or, because when TJ Hawkinson blows up for like 40 something points and you have 0, that's not a good feeling. And sort of just the reasoning there was, hey, listen, I get it. Former round 1 pick, incredible talent. All these players are out. He should be force-fed, high volume. But at the same time, he's the chalkiest tight end of the slate. The chalkiest tight end of the slate typically flops disastrously, like almost every single time. He was averaging under 30 yards per game up until this massive blow-up spot. And part of it too, so we had that call, and I really appreciated you picking up the phone. I felt shook by the week. And I don't know if it was just because, I loved Lamar plus Mark Andrews stacks the week before, and just for some reason I didn't get there. And it everyone else is like, oh, I think the Patriots are a really tough matchup. I'm going to play this. And I'm like, no, I think the Patriots are an amazing matchup. And I still didn't get there. And I felt shook by that. And I was looking for something like that in this week. and I couldn't find it. And so like I called you, I'm like, I don't know what to do except for eat the quarterback chalk. I think the chalk is really good this week. I think Khalil Herbert, Saquon Barkley, Jamal Williams are the three best running back plays. I think Stephon Diggs, who sucked last week, was the best wide receiver play. I think TJ Hawkins is right up there with them. And the quarterbacks, to me, it should go Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, Lamar Jackson, Geno Smith, and Marcus Mariota, who didn't have a good game, but I would have put him fifth. And so I don't know what to do here. And you're like, yeah, I'm like, I think I'm just looking for permission to play the QB chalk. And you're like, yeah, I think that's what I'm doing as well. And so I started to, feel a little bit better about what I was doing. I did end up going with either Josh Allen or Jalen Hurts. And, I did casually mention Jared Goff, and I did like Geno, but I had zero. And the next morning, I overslept my alarm with 20 minutes to go. My phone died in the middle of the night, and I saw all the weather concerns. And I'm like, yeah, maybe I should swap to some Seattle Detroit game stacks. And I thought about it for a minute, and time constraints, whatever. I was just like, nah. And I like how my lineups were built to counter that, which was supposed to be one of the chalkiest game stacks of the week. It was built to counter it, where instead of playing Josh Reynolds and TJ Hawkinson, I played, and I feel so bad, I kind of talked you into this, is Khalif Raymond, which ended up being a horrible play because Tom Kennedy, who I legitimately thought about as something that could wreck this play, ended up playing over him, which is crazy because they cut him a few weeks ago, and it was on Hard Knocks, and Dan Campbell saying, listen, it breaks our heart to let you go. You've really impressed us. You should be on any other of the 31 NFL teams. But the problem is, we need an outside wide receiver. We have all these great slot wide receivers, and that's kind of all you could do, but you do it really well. And then he played over Khalif Raymond. And so my reasoning there was just Ben Johnson talks about how much he loves the slot position, how hard it is for a defense to neutralize a slot wide receiver, how he came from Miami, where Jarvis Landry led the team in receptions every year. And he was 3,100. And, what we talked about was he had over 100 yards in his last start. He had 2 100-yard games in his last 8 starts. Meanwhile, Josh Reynolds in his 5-year, 1,800-snap career has never had a 100-yard game. He's coming off of his best game. And so it was a lot of calculated ownership plays. Same thing with Josh Jacobs, where it's okay, Josh Jacobs, I could see, is a great play. The dude averages 12 more fantasy points per game in wins than losses. I think Las Vegas wins this game. And but it's also Josh Jacobs, who's one of the most volatile players in fantasy always. And, the spread was maybe not even in Las Vegas's favor. It was at least really close. And just a number of players like that. And it just didn't go that way. But is that good process? You want to finish last or first. And if that's what we're aiming at, I had a great week because I finished last in a lot of spots.
Yeah. Well, so first off, we just got a big win there from you talking because the kids and Abby just got back from the playground, and Evelyn was throwing a huge fit downstairs right before her nap time. So she got in her room.
This Scott guy is just always going on never-ending monologues. Why wouldn't he let my dad talk?
She got in her room right before you wrapped all that up. So that was perfect timing. People didn't have to hear her screaming. Yeah. So for me, I'll never beat myself up about missing out on Josh Jacobs chalk getting 37 points, right? To me, I had Josh Jacobs in week 1 at 1% owned when everybody's looking at that and going, what an idiot, this guy's playing Josh Jacobs. That's when I want that play. I was maybe a little disappointed that I didn't get on Miles Sanders this last week because same thing, right? Miles Sanders was chalky the week before I had him, and I had him because I liked him and we're going to play some chalk. But then you get on him again the next week when everybody moves off of him, right? But the thing is, if you're seeing, to me, one of the things I want to look for is, am I on the guys who can pop for big games? And ideally, am I on them at low ownership, right? The Josh Jacobs 1% owned, it hurts when the guy is 1% owned and bombs because you're just like, oh God, like I got that so wrong. But did you actually get it wrong, or did it just not work in your favor in the small sample size of that week? And so, yeah, to me, looking at like the Hawkinson thing kind of eats me up a little, because I like all week I hit on the reasons why he was a great play. And when you and I got on the phone, I was like, yeah, Hilo's over here talking about Josh Reynolds and like a combo stack of Josh Reynolds, TJ Hawkinson, and Rashad Penny. And I was like, but I feel like we can do better, like Khalif Raymond. And I honestly think the Khalif Raymond call was sharp in terms of like, are we really going to predict that Tom Kennedy is going to come up and play over him? Like Khalif Raymond had 731 snaps last year with Dan Campbell as head coach. They like the guy. I think that fumble definitely hurt his playing time a little bit in terms of like, all right, well, I don't think he got a target after that fumble, right? It's like, all right, we're not going back to you after that. But 3 targets and a carry before that. It's like he was involved in the game plan. But yeah, I mean, like it's one of those things where I can look at the week objectively and say I wasn't going to win no matter what, because by the time I got to the weekend, I was going to play one of the like high priced quarterbacks. But I could have had George Pickens, I could have had TJ Hawkinson, I could have had I had Rashad Penny, and that would have been a really nice starting point there, right? I almost got on to Eckler on my main build. He was on one of my rosters, and Eckler plus Rashad Penny. I ended up instead on Khalil Herbert and Rashad Penny. But from like a profit point, I think it was great. Like I just, if I miss out on high owned games that I wasn't convicted on, it never bothers me. And that was what we talked about on when, and I know which like the feeling you had on Sunday. I said this to you on or on Saturday. I said it to you. It's like sometimes you just get tied up in spend so much time looking at the slate that it no longer is clear to you. It's all convoluted. And sometimes you just need a talk with somebody else to reset your perspective. And I was in that place in week 3, where on Saturday night, I was like, man, I love this slate up until like Friday night. And now Saturday night, I'm like, I've spent too much time with it. It's all bunched up in my mind. But what I said to you was, it's okay to play chalk if you're convicted on it, right? And I brought up the Antonio Brown game from like 2015 when he was 50% owned and put up over 50 points against the Raiders. I brought up the Devontae Adams game against the Bengals last year where he was like 40% owned and put up over 40 points. There's all these Christian McCaffrey games. Like if you're convicted on a player, that player is not going to win you the tournament because 20 other percent of the field, 30 other percent of the field has that guy, but also you can't win the tournament without him, right? And so to me, if I'm highly convicted on a piece, I don't care if it's chalk or not. The issue, like for me, Jamal Williams, fine play, wasn't going to play him at chalk just because I know that his ceiling it's going to be so hard for him to bury me. He hit like 90th percentile, 95th percentile outcome, and he still didn't bury. He wasn't the reason I lost. He hit 4x basically. The Josh Jacobs one, that's one where you just say, look, I'm not going to win this weekend. For me, it was like, I'm not going to win this weekend anyway, because he's not a guy I'm going to play at chalk. TJ Hawkinson, I was very high on him all week. And then because of his high ownership, I was like, I'll go a different direction. So that's one where I'm like, well, maybe I wasn't convicted on him because he's a tight end and we know what the tight end position is like. And, we play out that game again and maybe he has a 12-point game, right? But that's a spot where ownership influenced me more than like my own thoughts on the play. And then, but other than that, like to me, it was just to me. So I got Hurts, Devonta Smith, and AJ Brown, right? And all the touchdowns came on the ground. 3 of them came from running backs. But if I can get that stack, which had averaged 67 points a game, and the week before had combined for 84 points, with Hurts only throwing 3 passing touchdowns and only 1 apiece going to these guys, right? Like if I can get that at super low ownership, to me, that's just like, that's a smash, right? Over time, you're going to make money off of that. What else do I have? I don't know. But yeah, to me, it was just like, I put together the week in a good way. And it wasn't, if I'd maybe built 15 or 20 rosters, I would have had some of these other things that hit and that I was on all week. But yeah, and I think that's important too, to note about the chalk thing is like people just go so far one way or the other. They want to play all the chalky pieces because it makes them feel safe and comfortable, or they want to just move off the chalk because they think that that's what they're supposed to do. But you just need to move off in like a couple spots. And if you can do that, then like you're in good shape. One of the things that I also like to look at is I like to calculate like the floor and ceiling myself on my roster, not from projections, but just like if everything goes right, what do I get on this roster? And if everything goes wrong, what do I get on this roster? And I looked at my roster on Saturday night and it was like, okay, if everything goes right, I can tally up a good 245 points without getting like crazy in the way I'm projecting this. But also, if things go wrong here, I was like, this roster could score literally like 105 to 110 points. And I don't even know what it scored in the end, but it was like 115 to 120, you know? And so I knew that was in the range of outcomes, but it was different. It was a different build than other people had, which that's how you win. When, like, I don't know, you needed Jacobs this last week to win. You needed Hawkinson this last week to win. You needed one of these Detroit, Seattle quarterbacks to win. But that didn't win it for you because all those guys were chalky except for Goff. So it's like you still needed other things to win it for you. And these people won because of other things. So, yeah, I don't know. It's just one of those weeks where chalk hits is the way I look at it. And what's cool about this season is every week has been really different. Chalk hit week 1 and week 4, but like in very different ways. And then we've had 2 weird weeks in between that. So just like the more this stuff goes through, the more it kind of puts the field into a tailspin where they don't know where to go. And that just keeps opening up EV for us over time.
Yeah, great call on Rashad Penny. You put me on that. And I really thought that was one of the, like, regardless of the results, it was one of the sharpest leverage plays. Like, I probably, you know, if you were playing Rashad Penny, you were kind of fading a lot of the other pieces in that game. And, you know, all the lineups that smashed kind of just went all in on Seattle and Detroit. Like, it had Penny plus Geno plus Metcalf plus Lockett plus Reynolds plus Hawkinson plus Jamal Williams. It was like the nuts, like, so you don't see that coming, but really just made so much sense. Like I get how volatile and risky he is because, like, obviously, granted, especially this archetype, but also Penny himself. But, you know, for tournaments, the upside argument is all you need to make. And it's like, okay, he's direct leverage off of the chalkiest player to slate, Jamal Williams. Seattle could win that game. It was a close spread. Detroit's down a number of pieces, and like the spread was moving. The Lions were the best matchup to opposing running backs this year and bottom 6 every year since 2019. Penny himself has hit 22.5 fantasy points in 4 of his last games, averages 29 in his top 50% of those games. A massive usage last week, 15 touches, 69% of the snaps. And then Miles that money was all over. So those are like 2 amazing leverage plays. And I really think this year in particular, there's going to be more credence towards playing these cheaper leverage type running backs just because year for 0 RB.
So Scott's gone. I thought my connection was bad. Maybe it was Scott's connection that was bad. Yeah, so let's talk about what do I want to talk about? Well, one of the things that I want to talk about is this early in the season. This doesn't really relate to things we were talking about before, but this early in the season, we can have these spots where people have these preconceived notions about teams, and it's different from the reality of the teams. And so let's look forward to this next week, because I think that Scott and I are going to start looking forward to this next week a little bit when he gets back on. Is a team like Atlanta is 3rd in adjusted line yards on offense, which is incredible. Obviously, 3rd out of 32 teams. And this week they're playing the Bucs, who are we think of the Bucs as this team that, like, oh, you can't run on them and you can't. Teams just pass the ball against them, right? Don't use running backs against the Bucs. The Bucs are 27th in adjusted line yards. on defense. And we know that Atlanta's going to come into this game and try to run the ball. And this is the sort of thing where, let's see, Scott's texting me. What are we saying? His internet is down. So yeah, maybe this will be a shorter pod than normal, but if Scott hops back on, we'll have Scott and JM. If not, we'll wrap this up here in a little bit. But yeah, I'll talk a little bit about this next week and some of the things that we can think about this next week, because I have gotten pretty deep into this week. And I think that one of the things that we see at this point in the season, I talk about this sometimes, is when I first started playing MLB DFS, I didn't know all 30 teams. I knew one team really well, the Red Sox. I didn't know the other teams. And I came in and just used advanced stats to direct me on what players to play and what games to load up on and so on and so forth. And I would always look at other people's rosters and be like, why are you guys playing these plays? It doesn't make any sense. And I always think about that because now I've been doing NFL content for 9 years, and all of us have been playing fantasy football all this time. And we all have our preconceived notions and all these things we know for sure about all these teams. But if we think of ourselves as like, what if this were my first year playing NFL DFS? What if I didn't know these players? What if I didn't have biases? What would I be doing instead? And I think that's one of the toughest things for like somebody like Scott and me to do, because we know so much about the teams. We know so much about the NFL, but it kind of allows us to get a broader perspective on what some of these situations are and how we can use them to our advantage. So that Atlanta one this week is one that stands out to me, where Tampa's favored by 9 points and they're at home, right? And maybe Tampa just runs away with this game. But also, if you're Atlanta, they've played in 4 one-score games. And as they've talked about, they've been basically 2 plays away from being 4-0, 2 plays away from being 0-4. But they've been in all of these games, and that could end up being the case again this week. And so that's the sort of spot that we want to look at. Another spot that I think is really interesting this week. We've just talked about how bad the Lions defense is. Well, and how specifically how bad the Lions run defense is. Well, it's easy to look at a spot like Lions at Patriots and say, let's say Bailey Zappi is under center for the Patriots. It's easy to look at that and say, well, obviously the Patriots are going to get smashed in this one, and the Lions are going to put up points. And then I was kind of looking at that game last night, and it was like, what are the Patriots going to do? They had that game against the Bills last year where they had, I think it was 3 pass attempts, and there was some weather in that game, but 3 pass attempts. They're just like, look, well, let's just keep running the ball. Falcons did it this last week. 10-play drive, 10 runs, right? If you're running hot on the ground, keep doing it. So we have this spot where the Patriots are going to take advantage. Patriots first or second or third in adjusted line yards on offense right now. They're going to be taking on this Detroit run defense that so far hasn't been able to stop anybody. And they're just going to pound the ball, right? They also have an adaptable defense that throws everything at a quarterback. And so I was kind of thinking through that game last night. Then I look at the Vegas lines. Patriots are favored by 3 points. Patriots are implied to score 24.75, which is like within 0.75 points of Minnesota and the Chargers and one other offense that stood out to me. And from the outside, from our perspective, from the outside, it's just like, oh, the Patriots suck. And we know the Lions are 1-3, but their offense has looked really good, and they're probably going to come in and dominate this game. But if we kind of expand our thinking a little bit, we start to find places where we can find edges that the field isn't finding. And I think that one of the biggest mistakes we can make is just being so results oriented, where we look at a week like this last week and everything hit, and we're like, oh, I should have had this, this, and this. But similar to what Scott and I were just talking about TJ Hawkinson, he could have had 12 points. He could have had 8 points. If we played out that game 100 times, he's not scoring whatever he scored, 30 plus points, time in and time out, right? That was his high end of what he could do. But there's going to be a lot of other games where he finishes lower. Now, Scott was also talking about Rashad Penny's range of outcomes. And that's something that Scott and I talked about on Saturday, is we crave safety and we crave certainty just as humans. And so when we pull that over to DFS, well, we have a setup where let's look at the chalk wide receivers this last week, right? If you're talking about the one-offs at wide receiver, Deontay Johnson, Brandon Cooks, Curtis Samuel. Well, what's the ceiling on these guys? Deontay Johnson, this is off the top of my head, so I could have this slightly wrong, but I think it was 3 games last year, maybe 4 games of 20 plus DraftKings points. That's crazy for a guy who's priced at $6K and has Mitch Trubisky as his quarterback. It's crazy for him to be chalky. It's crazy for everybody to want to play that guy. But the reason everybody wants to play that guy is because he puts up 14 points. The next week he puts up 15. The next week he puts up 12. The next week he puts up 18. And you look through his game logs and you're like, double digit, double digit, double digit. It looks so good. Same thing with Brandon Cooks, right? He had 1 30-point game last year, a couple other games over 20, and then everything else, it's like, hey, this guy always scores double-digit points. Curtis Samuel, all these short area looks, keeps getting these double-digit point games. And so we crave that certainty. But what we see then is we get these scores kind of bunched up like this, and you want your scores to be on this side of that bunch up or that side of that bunch up. If you're listening to this via podcast and haven't left this solo pod yet, I'm using my hands to convey what I'm talking about. But it's like these scores that are bunched up in the middle are what feels so comfortable to everybody. And that's why we say rosters that finish all the way to the left or all the way to the right, rosters that finish first or last, is because when you have all these rosters that are sort of all these players that are bunched up in the middle, if you get the players who, like Rashad Penny, he misses, he's way over here compared to these players bunched up. But if he hits, he's way over here. And it's so much harder for people to hold on to players like that. And that's why we always want to think about range of outcomes. So when I talk about, well, I was fine not playing Jamal Williams. Now, granted, everybody's conviction plays are different. He wasn't a conviction play for me. What I saw was if he has a huge game, it's still kind of in this bunched up area of scoring. If he has a bad game, it's not going to be that bad. It's going to be somewhere in this range of scoring, right? He's going to score like 12 to 24 points was what I was thinking. And then you could break it down. If he gets 100 yards, he needs 100 yards and 2 touchdowns just to hit salary. And in fact, Zandamir on our site said that last week. He said, and we have notes on our ownership projections for Inner Circle members, like strategy notes. And in his strategy notes for that, he said, if you break down Jamal Williams scoring, what he's going to do, he's only going to get 1 or 2 catches, right? So he needs 100 yards and 2 touchdowns to hit value. And Zandamir was like, if like 2 touchdowns is such a high-end outcome that if I'm betting on a guy getting 2 touchdowns, I want him to be able to break the slate with 2 touchdowns. And so if I'm looking at that, I'm like, well, yeah, his range is still kind of in this bunched up area. So let me go in a different direction. Now, if we looked at TJ Hawkinson, which is kind of what set me down this path talking about this, is TJ Hawkinson, you could say his range is he misses over here. But if he hits, he could hit all the way over here and have a score that you literally had to have. And that was what we saw this last week. And so I think that was one of my mistakes this last week, was moving off of TJ Hawkinson when he was a player I was convicted on before looking at ownership projections. Whereas a player like Jamal Williams, ownership projections was part of the reason why I moved off of him. Another thing I said last week was these guys who are bunched up in the middle, sometimes it's valuable to take those guys if they're low owned, because you can just get those guaranteed points. So now Deontay Johnson totally bombed 5th percentile outcome. But generally speaking, like if nobody's on Deontay Johnson, that's the time when I'm going to be like, I'll just take the 18 points from Deontay Johnson, right? He's not going to win me the tournament, but it's so hard to get all the spots on your roster, right? That if you can just lock in points on or higher owned, that's when I want to. Jamal Williams would ever have been low owned this last week, but that's the type of spot where I want to say, I'll take Jamal Williams if he's low owned, because he can just give me this solid score and I don't have to overthink it. Once he's high owned, that's where I typically want to move off it. On the flip side of that, I played Khalil Herbert. Now, why? Well, because Khalil Herbert has this explosive per play upside. Jamal Williams had that 50-yard run, but that's the first time we've ever seen that in a very lengthy career. Whereas Khalil Herbert, we've seen it time and time again. He can rip off these chunk gains. And so that's the type of player that it's like, yeah, he's high owned, but he could put up a score that I can't survive without. And so we don't want to think about these guys as the guys who win us the tournaments, but we do want to think about, can they put up a score that I can't survive without? And am I convicted on this play? If I'm convicted on the play, then it's totally fine to play that chalky play. And I think that's one of the biggest things that we need to understand as DFS players is what is too much and what's too little in terms of like swinging toward, oh, this guy's high owned, I got to get off him, or this guy's low owned, I want to play him. And recognizing that there's that middle ground is something that Scott and I were talking about on Saturday, is like, yeah, we like these quarterbacks and we're convicted on them. I don't care that they're high owned. I feel like they're the best plays on the slate. Granted, Geno was like there in the next tier right below those guys. And so, yeah, we would have made more money this last weekend playing that way. But over time, it's not like playing Hurts, A.J. Brown, and Devonta Smith was going to lose me money on that slate, right? If we could play out that slate 100 times, playing those three together is going to make, at low ownership, is going to make me money over time. And so that's why these, top of the show, I said, I felt it was one of my most plus EV weeks ever. We have to be able to separate what happened from what we did well or poorly, essentially. And that's why we say process over results. And that's one of the hardest things to do, right? Because I've had a couple rosters this year that did well, but I was like, those weren't really great rosters. Like those rosters might have lost me money over time. I've had several other rosters that it's like, this roster would have made me money over time. It just didn't hit in the small sample size of this week. And the more we can shift our thinking toward that, the more we can kind of set ourselves up for success as we move forward into DFS. Okay, so if Scott were here, one of the things that we would do next is probably take a quick overview look at this next week's slate. So I actually want to do that real quickly. And then I'm going to get out of here because I'm doing a solo pod on fantasy points. I hope you guys don't mind it. Hopefully you guys are still sticking around. But yeah, let's talk about this next week's slate and just kind of give you an overview. Obviously, it's Tuesday. There's a lot to work through, a lot to still get to on this week's slate. But this week, what does this week give us? So first off, let's look at the teams with the highest implied team totals. The Bills are playing at home against the Steelers. They're implied for a slate-topping 30.5 points. The next highest projected teams are the Bucks at 28.5, the Eagles at 27.5. Now, what's interesting here is the Bills are 14-point favorites. The Bucks are 9-point favorites. We already touched on that spot a little bit. That game could play closer than people think. And then the Eagles are 5-point favorites against the Cardinals. So that's the one game where you could see the Cardinals kind of pushing the game environment. So we really have these three top teams are all playing in games where they're favored by a decent amount. Again, Eagles are on the road, favored by 5, which is like a huge number to be favored by on the road. But that game being on the road could keep it a little bit closer. But we also have three teams that want to keep scoring deep into games. We've seen it for decades from Tom Brady. If the old Patriots had an offense that was capable of scoring points throughout a game, that's what they would keep doing. Same thing with these Bucks teams, is they stay aggressive throughout games. We've seen it with the Bills. They've already won, 41-7 this year and had another blowout win this year, like 31-10 against the Rams. They're going to try to keep scoring deep in games. And then we have 2 games from Philadelphia where they just died in the second half. But importantly, after both of those games, the whole team was talking about basically frustration over how they played in the second half and saying they want to be a team that keeps scoring points throughout the game. Not that we would expect Philadelphia to just shut down the Cardinals and have one of these 24-0 halftime leads, but it's important to recognize, hey, this team wants to keep scoring points deep into the game. So we have these 3 teams that all could score 30-plus points, even if the opponent doesn't keep up with them. But then the next thing we have to think about is what really wins us a slate if we're stacking a team is when this team scores 5+ touchdowns, when they score 35 points, when they score 42 points. And those are the spots where you get these scores that you literally had to have in order to win a tournament. So when we're looking at the Eagles and the Bills and the Bucks, we've got these high-priced players on offenses that probably won't score 5+ touchdowns. They're still really sharp plays, and it's perfectly sharp to go there and even load up on those games. But then we also want to think, are there any other game environments this week where the 2 teams can push each other in such a way that those game environments just move way past what these individual teams can do on their own? So a couple games that stand out to me in that regard, we have Chargers at Browns. This game played to a 47-42 score just last season. In that game, Austin Eckler had 3 touchdowns. Mike Williams had 165 receiving yards, I think it was. Justin Herbert, this is all off the top of my head, but so these might be slightly off, and they're pretty specific numbers. But Justin Herbert had 4 passing touchdowns and 398 passing yards. Nick Chubb had 161 rushing yards and a touchdown. Kareem Hunt had 2 touchdowns. David Njoku had his breakout 7 catches for 147 yards and a touchdown game. So what we see here is typically these blow-up back-and-forth games come from explosive. They always come from explosive players, but typically they come from passing attacks, right? But because the Chargers are typically not as good against the run, and because the Browns have explosive runners, they're able to get these explosive plays in that way as well and have these back-and-forth affairs. David Njoku, same thing, right? He's not getting downfield work so much as he had a 71-yard reception in that game last year, and he's able to catch the ball 10, 15 yards downfield and produce a big play out of it. So that's a very interesting game to consider this week in terms of games where the 2 teams could push each other back and forth. And I think that's really about it for this next week. We've got the Dolphins at the Jets, I think is a very interesting one, where Teddy Bridgewater is I don't think they're going to change the offense too much, right? Mike McDaniel is a very aggressive coach by nature and wants to be putting up points. So sure, they'll run the ball a little bit more. Raheem Mostert looks like a really sharp play at the early point of this week. But they're probably going to run their similar offense. They want to get Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle going downfield to force the defense to respect the run game. So that's one that I'm interested in as well. And then from there, we've got Texans at Jags. The Jags, same type of thing as those first three teams, right? They're not going to get pushed on the scoreboard. They're going to have to do it on their own. Bears at Vikings. Vikings are a team with under Kevin O'Connell that we might see them staying aggressive deep into games, which we didn't see from Mike Zimmer. But it's unlikely that the Bears are keeping pace with them. We also know that Eberflus is going to try to take away that downfield passing and force the Vikings to march the field. Lions at Patriots. Highly unlikely that we see the Patriots just popping off for a monster game unless it's one of these Browns type games where they're just hammering it on the ground and ripping off chunk games and scoring a bunch of points in that way. Seahawks at Saints. Saints defense is not as good as it has been in the past, at least not by advanced metrics. So that's an interesting spot, although we just have two offenses that this is the type of game that's implied 20.25 for the Seahawks, 25.75 for the Saints. We probably see the score end up somewhere in that range as opposed to the 30-plus pointers. Although that game is actually somewhat interesting in terms of how people will view it and where it could end up going. Titans at Washington is implied, or over under is 42.5 points. Neither team is implied for more than 23 points. So we'll skip over that one for now. Same thing with 49ers and Panthers. 49ers implied for 22.75. Panthers are only implied for 16.25. It was 16.5 a couple hours ago. So that's falling down. And then the Cowboys at Rams. Rams implied for 24 against this ferocious Cowboys defense. We already know that Matthew Stafford has thrown an interception in every game this year, and I believe he's thrown an interception in 14 of his 21 regular season starts with the Rams. I could be off by one or two numbers on that, but something in that range. Tied for the most sacks taken in the league, playing against this opportunistic Cowboys defense. So that's another one where we can see the field kind of thinking, oh, maybe the Rams smash in this spot, but really maybe the Cowboys, who are 2,500 on DraftKings, end up smashing in this spot. So that's kind of a compact overview of this week's slate, what I'm seeing from my end with some early prep. And yeah, I think that's everything. We're gonna call it a day here. And I appreciate you guys for hanging out. I appreciate Scott for being on here for the time that he could afford to give us. And yeah, we will see you back here next week. See you on Fantasy Points, see you on 1 week season, and we will see you at the top of the leaderboards in week 5.